Okay, it's a 6-letter word, but then so is pedant. What I mean when I say a 4-letter word is that it's an expletive, and if you're being really rude and wanting to shock. I know, we're less than a minute in and I've already dropped that one into the mix. Typically in British English, an expletive is 4 letters long, thus 4-letter word is a euphemism for rude word. My name is Dom Davis with 3 and 5 letters respectively, although my full name is 24 letters long and requires 27 bytes to store in UTF-8. Not that that's relevant in any way, it's just I've kicked off with this whole letter counting thing and it's very hard to jump off that particular track. I'm a software consultant, another 4-letter word for many people, who has his finger in many pies. Sometimes I do CTO type things, which seems to involve listening to companies, the problems they've got and going, do this, while not actually having to worry about what this is and how it's going to get done. Occasionally I train people in Golang, but mostly I wrote code in Golang, so a mixed bag of things. My job allows me to work from, well, anywhere really, but I choose to work from home. Prior to the pandemic, I chose to work in an office, but not for the reasons you might think. This isn't the first period of my life where I have worked from home either. Hopefully, I have concluded the part of my life that involves traditional offices, because I'm one of those who thrived during this whole pandemic thing. I believe the technical term for people like me is weirdo, but I'm not an expert, so don't quote me on that. And while we're on the subject, I am not an expert. I am a Neo4j certified developer with some A-levels and some good GCSEs. The only BSc I have is my bronze swimming certificate. I have the gold and the silver too. The Neo4j knowledge is useful for tomorrow's talk, and not so much for this one. The academic qualifications probably aren't relevant, and swimming will not feature at all. So, in summary, not an expert. With that out of the way, let's delve into what remote means. For me, the word remote means one of 2 things: TV remote, or a remote island, or a jungle or something. For others, it may conjure up different things. But these days, we're also seeing it on job adverts. Location remote. Or more likely, location remote with a bunch of qualifiers. So what does remote mean? Dictionary on my Mac defines remote to be quite a lot of things, actually. And we discover that remote, as in remote control, is a noun, whereas all the other meanings are adjectives, which I should have remembered from my GCSE English, grade B. It also tells us the origin is, in the sense of far apart, is from the late Middle English, and the word came from the Latin remotus, or removed. I did not do Latin at GCSE. The origin ties into the first definition of remote provided by the dictionary: of a place situated far from the main centres of population, distant. The area is remote from the usual tourist routes, a remote Welsh valley. Although I'm not sure how far down my list of places that are remote I'd need to go before I got into Welsh Valley. It also gives an example for time, distant in time, a golden age in the remote past. Notice how both definitions use the term distant. Distant is also used when talking about relationships. Distantly related, a remote cousin. And then, having very little connection with or relationship to, the theory seems rather intellectual and remote from everyday experience. Other definitions include of a chance or possibility, unlikely to occur. Chances of a lasting peace become ever more remote. And aloof and unfriendly in a manner, she seems remote and patronizing. There is one more definition, which I'm going to describe as the modern definition, and I'm going to skip that for now deliberately, because that's the actual definition I take issue with. I logged all of the other definitions into some random free sentiment analyzing website, and unsurprisingly, they all came out as negative, apart from the 2 shorter ones, which came out as neutral because not enough words. Now, despite a remote tropical island being, to my mind, a very positive association, the way we define the word remote is by using mostly negative terms, which is a problem, because that negative association seems to have crept into the modern definition, and I don't understand why the definition itself isn't negative. So in the late 90s, I worked in second-level support in a large investment bank. The systems we looked after were a proprietary messaging platform used to move trade data between markets. Being a global bank meant we had a support team that needed to be available 24/7, and the easiest way to do that was to split the team over the various continents which the bank had a presence. So we had people in London, Stamford, Connecticut, Chicago, Singapore, and Zurich. Of these locations, London and Zurich are the closest, but at 777 kilometers, they are not exactly next door to each other. Now, I would class my job back then as a standard office job. I traveled to an office, I sat at a desk in that office, I had a computer and a phone provided for me by my employers. It's not a remote position. And as a quick aside, I should point out this isn't this office. This is from around 2008. The only image I have of my place of work before that is this. This is a tier 1 investment bank, world's most pathetic Christmas tree. Obviously, the ones the public could see were towering beauties and immaculately shaped and all, but yeah. Anyway, desk job, distributed team. Note the term. I would not describe us as remote because we interacted constantly. And we were all in offices, just different offices. Being the late 90s, video conferencing wasn't really a thing, but we did have an IRC-based chat system, which we all used heavily. And of course, telephones were a thing if you needed to speak to people. They were clunky landlines, but they allowed us to conference people in very easily if we needed a group chat. Oh, and there was also email. So much email. But that was more a function of the organization than the team. And it worked. Despite it being a staid, lumbering organization with conservative views and very tight controls on everything, our team functioned as a cohesive whole, mainly because we dealt with the fact that not everyone was in the same room or even the same time zone on a day-to-day basis. Conversations we usually had on IRC, even if they were between colleagues in the same office, so that there was a written record for the others to see. Verbal conversation could be transcribed to chat or relayed in our regular team calls so that everyone was kept in sync. And not just work stuff either. This went on for all communication, the water cooler style communications, the general team chat, the messing around. Everything that a quote-unquote in-person team does, but in a different form. Now, despite our geographic distribution, there were periods over the weekend when it wasn't office hours for any of our team members. And also, while we were all highly skilled at our jobs, specific knowledge of some systems was not necessarily evenly distributed among everyone. And that has nothing to do with the fact that the team were distributed, and everything to do with the fact that this is the reality for complex systems. Different people become repositories for different bits of esoterica. So we had a rota of people who were on call, and they had a laptop and could dial in from wherever they were. And I mean dial in. This is before ADSL was a thing. And quite often support calls would be in the middle of the night and you'd be dialing in from home. So 1990s, clunky corporate, and people were working from home. Fast forward 20 years and 2016 rears its ugly head. 2017 looked at what 2016 did and went, hold my beer. 2018 did similar, and then 2019 looked at what had gone before, laughed and was quiet for a bit, and then went, watch this. Followed by 2020, which rocked up and declared that nobody gets to hold beer, or indeed anything, at least in public. All of those organizations that require people to work in the traditional office suddenly let everyone work from home, while Trevor McDonald read the news from his front room. You see, the 25 or so years between my experience of a distributed team and the pandemic has caused a lot of changes in the technology that enables working, well, from anywhere, really. My mobile phone can get a data connection that is faster than the wired LAN connection I had in the office in the 90s. I have a small, lightweight laptop with huge amounts of processing power and a very long battery life. Virtualization and VPNs mean we don't necessarily need to be using work networks and work-issued equipment. Instant messaging is far more ubiquitous, and video calling is quick and easy. Sadly, email hasn't died a death yet. Now, obviously, I am talking about a privileged section of society whose jobs are not actually location dependent. A huge number of workers still need to head into work every day because their jobs rely on their location. Shout out to the NHS, the workers at my local co-op, and my Amazon delivery drivers who have kept me alive over the past couple of years. It turns out, though, that most of the reticence to allow flexible working on location where it doesn't matter is about trust. Corporations do not trust their employees to work effectively if they are not in the office under the watchful eye. And in March 2020, the governments of many countries turned around and went tough And suddenly the genie was out of the bottle. We did somewhat end up with the other extreme, however, people working from home because they had to, regardless of the practicalities. I have a fantastic home office setup. Others were not so lucky. Kitchen tables were pressed into service, people struggled to source webcams and decent chairs to sit on, but we managed it because we had to. And that issue of trust, I'm going to suggest that if a person requires the threat of their boss looking over their shoulder to actually knuckle under and do some work, then they're going to slack off wherever they are. I know some companies actually reported increased productivity while their workforce was out. More importantly, though, we quickly developed effective means of communication because nobody was co-located. The lessons my team had learned all those years ago were learned from being geographically dispersed by loads of people. Zoom seemed to catch Skype asleep at the wheel and dominated the video conferencing market. Slack and Discord saw massive increases in their usage. And as ever, email stepped into the breach. Not that we needed or wanted it to. It wasn't remote working, it was distributed working. Remote implies distant, disconnected, which wasn't the case at all. And as some viral Zooms went to show, sometimes we were a little too connected. Pro tip, a laptop does not belong in the bathroom. It's now March the 767th, 2020, and we seem to be entering the living with COVID phase of the pandemic. So are we now at the panacea that is the perfect distributed workforce? No, because humans. When all this kicked off, a large number of my friends were over the moon. No more commutes, working on their own kit, which was often better than the kit they had at the office. But around about March the 90th, quite a few of them were sick of their home office, and we'd barely got to March 500th when even my most introverted friends confided that they were now over this isolation and that they would like to go back to the office at least sometimes. That is not to say that we should go back to how it was. Those people saying that a full-scale return to the office is now required almost certainly have a large property portfolio that focuses on commercial property. But perhaps we should use a hybrid model. One where people can work in an office if they want to, because it either suits them to work in proximity with others or because their home situation is not conducive to working. And one where people can work in other locations so they can attend to other demands on their time, like childcare. And so we see roles with remote working as an option. Sometimes it's a remote initially, which is code for when the office opens, you're coming in. Sometimes it's remote, but with a requirement to come in the office on a regular basis, but the common word is remote, and that worries me. The lack of trust I mentioned earlier is actually due to a lack of visibility, a lack of being able to see what someone is doing at any given time. And that lack of visibility is often down to a lack of communication because that person is remote, distant. But a distributed team, that works. And it's a model that has worked for decades. Multinationals have been running distributed teams, well, since forever. So the key to all of this is communication, a 13-letter word, which is probably now written as C11N because that's what's happening to all the long words in our industry. But I can't just go communicate, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk, partly because this isn't a TED Talk, and partly because that's a Heisen answer. It tells you simultaneously everything and nothing. It begs the question, how do we communicate? To which I answer, I have no idea. But I have an excuse. I have no idea what the situation is for the individuals in your team or organization. I have no idea what forms of communication need to be had, what forms of communication technology are available, or what is actually practical on a day-to-day basis. Some teams might go fully distributed. They may run on-site Google Hangouts that people join and stay joined to all day. Personally, I'd hate that. It also presupposes the ability to handle video calls. I have no idea of the prevalence of webcams in a corporate setting. Some teams may choose to go back to being fully co-located, but that needs to be a unanimous decision by the team, not an edict passed down from high or pressure from a majority rule. I suspect the reality will be hybrid, with some people choosing to come back to an office and others choosing to remain distributed. And a proper hybrid solution should allow easy change, resulting in a fluid, dynamic distribution. But just because the distribution is dynamic, it doesn't mean the structure and the communication should be. A hybrid solution is by its nature one that can be distributed. Even if the majority of the distribution is over a small area a lot of the time, such as a single office, you can have a change to a wider distribution. And that should not result in a change in communication. Because if it's not part of the day-to-day culture, then that change will not happen when it needs to. And you are back to having remote part-time people. And just like the co-located distributed factor, there's a sliding scale for the levels of communication. You need to find your team's place on it. My personal ideal is to have conversations done through either Discord or Slack. At a push, it could be done via Morse code by slamming my head into a drawer, and failing that, Microsoft Teams. Should we then need to jump onto something higher bandwidth, less asynchronous, I can then organize a video call, either direct in the messaging app or via one of the plethora of other options. If you can't do video, then voice. I try to avoid email, but that's just me. Sadly, my ideal is not met by everyone, so I have Slack, Discord, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, iMessages, Teams, Skype, Zoom, and BlueJeans all installed on my laptop, and I also use FaceTime, Whereby, Google Meetings, and occasionally a few other esoteric video conferencing apps, which is an absolute pain in the behind. But I'd still need all of those if I was working in an office because of the nature of my job. What works for me may not work for your situation. You are looking for a fairly unobtrusive asynchronous method of communication plus a reliable and user-friendly method of synchronous communication. Many alternatives exist for both, up to and including email and telephone. If you're not able to use those two methods of communication, at the very least, then one needs to ask some much more serious questions about communication in your organization. Honestly, the technology does not matter, provided it works. What matters is the team is either co-located or distributed. You cannot have a co-located team with one member working elsewhere. That is a distributed team. And the communication rules for a distributed team are different because great as face-to-face communication is, it suffers from a serious range limitation. That's not to say that members of a team that are co-located shouldn't talk. Absolutely they should. But they also need to be mindful of the distributed nature of the team and ensure that relevant information is disseminated in a timely and appropriate fashion to all team members. And it's that relevant information in an appropriate fashion that is usually the sticking point. Too much information is arguably worse than too little. You want to assure the correct amount of information using the correct channel for that information. So if I can introduce another four-letter word into the mix, be agile about the whole thing, although small a agile with no suits. Iterate, change what doesn't work, keep what does. And don't stop iterating, because as the team evolves, so will its way of working. Hopefully the changes will just be minor nudges in the right direction, but what you're striving for is the best way of working for your team in that moment. And only you and your team can know what that is. I want to finish up with the reason I started going back into an office. I was working from home, I had a very nice setup, a room to work in, and a family that didn't quite understand that interruptions could horribly derail my thought processes. So we rented an office. This gave me space to design the system free of distraction. And when we gained some interns, we kept the office because it made sense to be co-located. And the office was made as conducive to work as possible. Not frivolous things like ping pong tables, but setting people up with the right kit and surroundings they wanted. We liked our office, and we all had a say in it. These days, my personal situation is different, so I once again work from home. Should the requirement for a centralized co-located space appear in the future, I'll revisit the situation. Usually I live alone, although ironically enough, parts of this talk were written with 2 children kicking around because it's the Easter holidays. They are older now and require less looking after. And despite my physical separation from my colleagues and my clients, I am not remote, because remote is a 4-letter word.